Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining our Use the Brain Rules to Deliver Your Best Learning webinar. To hear today's presentation, please turn on your computer speakers or dial into 877-201-7923. During today's presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Please feel free to enter any questions you may have throughout today's presentation in the Q&A pod displayed on the left-hand side of the meeting room window. I will now turn it over to our presenter for today, David Smith with Virtual Gurus. Please go ahead.
Excellent, thank you. And welcome everyone. Delighted that you could join me. And we're going to be looking today at how we can actually use the brain rules to deliver our best learning. You know, there are many books that I've read over the various years, and they've all had some effect on me. But this one really changed my life quite a bit in terms of learning, probably about 6-7 years ago. We're going to talk about John Medina's Brain Rules, 12 Principles for Surviving and Thriving at Work, Home, and School. And we can see, you should have partaken in the actual poll at the bottom. There's two polls we've got there. One is, have you read or do you know of the John Medina's Brain Rules? And pretty much, most of you have not. You know, if this was Christmas time, I'd be encouraging you to put it on your Christmas reading list. You know, it really is a piece of work which is superb in terms of helping us to start to understand more about how the brain works. And for me, as we're going to look at today's webinar, I want to help you to then sort of think about how do I take what the research is telling me about how the brain works and apply it to us designing and delivering our best learning opportunities for us. You know, Medina himself, he's a molecular biologist. He knows a thing or two about how the brain works. His research and others' research has really helped us to start to begin to get a much better understanding of how our learners think and subsequently how that should actually influence the way in which we actually approach our design and delivery in order to achieve some successful learning outcomes. So in today's program, we're going to look at 6 of those brain rules. But before we do that, I mean, I'm sure most of us probably are very much aware about the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. You know, research that's actually shown us that people usually forget 90% of what they learn in a class within 30 days. That's Medina's research himself. You know, we know that if we actually teach our, provide learning to people and they're not about to use it or they don't use it quickly enough, they forget it. And that for me is staggering. You know, the thousands upon thousands of dollars that are invested every single year in corporate learning, and if that learner is not applying the learning very quickly, then unfortunately they are going to lose it. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at 6 of the brain rules. And we're going to look at how they apply to learning and really what it means for us in terms of either whether we design learning or whether we deliver learning. As we go forward, let me just ask you, put into the chat there for me, do you deliver learning or do you design it or what do you do with learning? You know, you're attending this session today. How would you describe yourself? Just go ahead and put it in the chat for me. Great to see that we've got Val from Sparta. We've got someone from Vegas, we've got Tracy from Richmond, we've got Vicky from New Brunswick in Canada, we've got Lakeisha from Washington, D.C., Caroline from Germany and Munich. I myself am based over here in the UK. But delighted to have you with you. Today, I'm going to bring with me what I call the 3 R's. Now, if you think about any sort of learning event, chances are there's something in that event that you'll have seen before or you've heard before. And the first of those R's is really, I want to remind you of maybe something you've read, maybe something you've heard, maybe something you've learned previously. There'll be elements you'll think, okay, David, I know that. I already have that. And that's fine. That's the first of those R's. The second, you may already be doing, or you may already be thinking that way. And I would just want to reassure you or validate that the research backs up that thinking. And then finally, I hope that by the course of today, given the fact that 75-80% of you have not read Medina's work, I'm going to be revealing quite a bit to you in terms of how these brain rules can actually be thought about and, importantly, how they can be applied. You see, Medina himself makes the quote or the statement that if you're in education, you're in the business of brain development. Maybe we don't think about it in that way as individuals that design and we deliver training, but we are in the business of developing brains. If you think about it, in today's business world, we are all pretty much knowledge workers. We're using our brain to actually work on a day-to-day basis. And if you're leading a modern corporation, from an L&D training perspective, you need to know how brains work. So we're going to look at Medina's work. It's actually been updated since it originally came out. 2009, I think, was when I first started looking at it and reading it. A friend of mine, Nanette Miner, actually provided that to me, gave me a copy of it. But today, there are 12 rules, and what we're going to do is we're going to focus on just 6 of those. We're going to look at survival, attention, stress, sensory integration, vision, and exploration. I'm not saying the other 6 don't apply to learning, but these were, for me, the very obvious ones. Very clear ones which I thought, great, yeah, there are reasons we do things in learning and training events, learning events that make sense. And now I know why they make sense. It's because the brain science, the neuroscience, or the understanding of how the brain works is now validating for me why we do things that we do when we're actually in training events. So we're going to focus on these 6. We're going to go through each of them in turn. Brian, to your question there, what were the 3 R's? It was remind, reassure, and reveal. Maybe I can ask Brittany to actually just pop that into chat for you. So it was remind, reassure, and reveal. It's something I've used from day one in training. It was given to me. I'm happy to hand it on and give it to anyone else. But for me, it kind of makes us understand that our learners are going to have seen something before, so we overcome the fact that they'll have seen it. So that's a remind. That they are probably doing something that we're going to be talking about, the reassure, and R for reveal, that we're going to talk about something new. So let's talk about something in terms of the first rule. The first rule is all about survival. And if you think about it, the human brain evolved. If you go back to the days of us living in the caves, actually having to sort of survive, we were no different to the saber-toothed tiger or to the actual mammoth that was out there. We were a species, an animal that had a body, that had a skeleton, that had all the different organs in the brain. The difference for us and what separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom is our brain has evolved. We are much more creative, much more innovative, or at least most of the people I know are. We physically, we think in different ways to maybe the rest of the animal kingdom. That's not to say that the rest are dumb, but it's just the way in which we actually do it, we're different. So if you think back to it, and in those caveman days, our role, if you like, was for us to survive. We had to make sure that we weren't going to be eaten by the next saber-toothed tiger that came along. How did we do that? Well, that survival rule got us to start creating tribes and communities. We started to build relationships with other Homo sapiens. We started to come together. We created families. We built communities. And that's no different. But how does that actually apply in learning? Well, if you think about it, part of that building the community is we build those relationships. And if you think about it from a learning perspective, we build those relationships in a learning event by actually getting involved in doing discussion, by doing introductions at the very beginning of an actual session. Introductions are very important. In fact, they're vitally important for us to actually survive. If you think about it, right at the very beginning of an actual session, we'll do various warm-up activities. We'll ask people to put into chat, where are you joining us from? Put into chat, what's your role in actually in learning? Are you a designer? Are you a deliverer of learning? We'll get people to actually make introductions. Why? Well, you're actually attending to the survival rule. You're attending to the fact that, when we actually are working together in terms of the actual way we actually need to connect, we need to make those relationships, it's important that we do things like that learning map. like the fact that we've got the initial chat that we actually do when we come into these sessions, like the fact that we take introductions. We ask people to introduce themselves. That seems to be something that we actually do continually. We're actually constantly needing to make that movement. So what I'd like to do, you can see that there's a poll there, as well as a second question. Do you conduct learner introductions in every single session you do? That's important. I wanted to emphasize every session, because it's maybe the fact that we make the introduction, we've got a group of people going through a learning event, which is multiple modules. And we'll tend to do the introductions on the first day of that first module, whether that's face-to-face or whether it's virtual. But do we continue to do that? Do we help our learners to continue those relationships and continue going forward? So I'm seeing we've got about 47%. There's quite a few of you actually voted. Go ahead and voting those, and then we're sharing the results with you. So 48% of you saying, yeah, I always do. That figure's going between 46 and 48%. The rest of you are saying, maybe not always. And that's concerning, because I might have connected with you just 3 days ago, 4 days ago. But is that the end of it? Is that the only part of the relationship that I'm going to get from our conversations? Obviously, the team activities that we can actually do can actually help us to move that on even further. As we think about the survival rule, is the way in which we actually get an opportunity to team together, to actually collaborate, to actually cooperate, to discuss, to actually challenge, that helps us to extend that element of survival. It actually helps us to feel much more comfortable and trust the people that we're actually within the session. Great to see some of the team activities. Do a landscape. Where are you? The traditional. Where are you from? What is your position? What do you want from the session? The one thing I would say to you is, for those of you that are making the transition from face-to-face to virtual, don't do that in a serial fashion. Don't do it where you go down the attendee list and go from A to B to C to D and so on. If you're doing introductions, do what we're doing. Use the chat tools. Use a chat pod if you're using Adobe Connect. Pull up a pod and ask people to put in their comments in that way. It's much quicker. It's much more efficient. But ultimately, what you're actually doing is helping people to actually be heard individually. Part of that survival rule that we've always got to be thinking about is making sure that no one learner is going to dominate the conversation. We've all had them. In a virtual classroom, I call them the virtual vandals. They're people that want to monopolize the conversation. They're always wanting to actually volunteer their thoughts and their comments. They're the first people to actually respond to you. They're continually asking questions. Well, we've got to be very mindful that we don't allow one person to dominate and the rest of our learners to actually end up having to take a seat back. I'm going to remind you, on the left-hand side of your screen, you've got the Q&A panel. I want you to actually, anything specific you want to ask about any of the rules as we're going along, feel free to put a question in there. We're going to pick those up as we go along, and hopefully we'll grab a bit of time towards the end. Let's look at our second rule. This is one that you're probably going to turn around and say to me, David, I know this one. We don't pay attention rule. We don't pay attention to boring things. If you think about it in terms of the way that, whether it's a movie, the way that our television is actually run, we tune out so quickly. There's some sense that they're actually suggesting that our attention span has gone from 12 seconds to it's now 9 seconds. What's quite challenging in that is they actually believe that a goldfish's attention span is around 10 seconds. So it's kind of suggesting that the competition for our attention is dropping. The challenge for us is we have all of these different things coming at us, that we have so many things to be very attentive towards. Yeah, and Joel, yikes, exactly. If you think about it, there are definitely things in a training event that you can do which will guarantee you send your audience to sleep. You're putting it in right now. Plenty responding in there. No interaction. repeating the same main idea but using different sentences, being that sage on stage, being monotone in your speech or talking too much. There are plenty of things that we can actually do that naturally put our audience to sleep, that cause them to tune out. And if you're delivering training virtually, that's even much more of a challenge for you. You see, when we actually think about it, the evidence is showing us that what we need to do to actually design our training in a much more effective way is to think about resetting our learner brains every 10 minutes. You see, if you think about it and think about it from the point of view watching a video or a movie, it's not one constant thing that's happening all the time. The plot's changing, the camera angle changes, different characters come in and come out. Why? It keeps our attention. If we don't reset that attention piece every 10 minutes, the challenge we're going to have is that our learner's brain is going to switch off. We need to change up things. We need to change activities. We need to recapture attention. You can do that in so many different ways. Here in Adobe Connect, you see that we're actually doing that by changing layouts, so you're getting a completely different visual from time to time. We're doing it because you can see me on webcam. Again, that comes a little bit back towards that whole piece about survival. If you see me, you're not just seeing or hearing a voice in the sky. You're seeing the person. You're understanding that person is real. You're seeing me eyeballing you in the camera. Now you're not on webcam, so you're not doing it back to me, but, it's all about creating as much attention in these kind of environments. And the way we can do that, we can do it in so many different ways. We can tell stories and anecdotes. We can bring content alive by sharing examples. I can remember actually at one point, in terms of the attention rule, I had a real challenge where I was in a session, and I had someone, their audio line was actually producing an awful lot of background noise, an awful lot of automotive noise. Car engines revving, car horns going off, and I was like, where's that coming from? And I turned around it was an Indian audience I was working with at the time, and I turned around to Ahmad and I said, Ahmad, I'm sorry, I can identify the noises coming from your audio. Have you got the window open? And I said, no, David, the window is not open, but I'm in the car. I'm like, well, what do you mean you're in the car? He said, well, I'm joining your session, but I'm in the car. My friend's driving me. And he was sat in the passenger seat of his car. As I've done that, telling that story is painting a vivid picture in your mind. We're going to actually go a little later and actually talk about vision and talk about sensory input. But I mean, if you consider a large part of the attention challenge that we actually have comes from the fact that people have different expectations about the event. Whenever we run a virtual classroom session, we always provide these 5 guidelines, if you like. What we want the learner audience to be doing, what expectations that we actually want from them. Some of those are directed to, we want you to pay attention. Somebody's saying, I was in a webinar where someone was snoring on webcam. Wow, I love it. I love the fact that somebody got caught doing that, but I mean, doesn't that say a lot about either the person's resting time or the fact of, was the webinar actually that dull and boring they fell asleep? But I mean, a lot of these guidelines we actually put in place so that we can actually minimize the technical issues. Number one there, we don't want everything else open so it competes with bandwidth. But at the same time, we want to minimize distraction, particularly on a virtual classroom session. Because if you're distracted, you start multitasking. And research is showing that, and ladies, I'm sure you can probably tell us that ladies or women are meant to be better at multitasking than men. It's one of those urban myths. I'll tell you it's an even bigger urban myth because not a single person on the planet is capable of multitasking. Now you're probably going to go, no, we can multitask. Multitasking is not something that we are humanly built to do. We can only, like a computer, we can only take in one line of information at a time into our brains. We don't have a multiprocessor in our brain. So when we actually are talking, we can talk, and yes, we can actually pick up a cup, and I guess that could be classed as multitasking. but it's not actually using the same part of the brain. If we try to do things where we're using exactly the same exactly the same part of the brain, so we're actually talking at the same time as maybe trying to read something, that's where those two elements are going to cross over. And when that happens, there's a chance we're going to lose about 40% of our productivity. That 40% means that I'm not going to do one part as well as the other. You know, and multitaskers, according to the research from John Medina, actually make up to 50% more errors than those that monotask, those that actually do one thing at a time. You know, if you follow one course of action until you complete and then move to the next, then move to the next, we are much more efficient in doing that. And the chances are you might actually be multitasking right now. Are you? Even though you know that we've got a tool that tells you or tells us, we've got an attention or engagement dashboard that's actually turning around and telling me how many of you are actually being attentive. Go on, if you are multitasking with me, in chat, let me know, what is it you're doing? What's more important? And of course, if you are asleep, we're not going to hear from you. But you know, yeah, Stephanie, I do have emails that pop up. Deb, I am taking notes. Deb, I'm going to forgive you. You know, taking notes, great. You know, Stephanie, you're doing emails that pop up in the background. Remember my guidelines? You know, when we're actually doing a virtual session with our clients, we ask our people to sign out of email so that we remove that piece of multitasking. You know, we've got this thing, as I said, called an attention meter or engagement dashboard. It's giving us a complete list, you know, of you know, where people are, how many questions have actually been asked, you know, what is the attentiveness, how many people are actually using it the live screen. You know, there's some element of flex around them, you know, but, you know, clearly people are drinking a cup of tea. That's not multitasking. Taking notes, yes, that's multitasking. But, you know, we're in this world where we take our notes digitally. Taking notes on OneNote, drinking a cup of tea, I'm not going to suggest that something that actually requires us to do the motor skills is multitasking. You know, it's almost like saying someone can actually whistle and chew gum at the same time. That's not quite multitasking. Multitasking, we're talking about using the same part of the brain at the same time. So how do we stop people from multitasking? Well, we can call upon people by name. So we could turn around and say, well, you know, Stephanie, I know you're doing your email. I'm not going to call you out and tell me, you know, and say you're doing email. But to get Stephanie's attention back into the session, I might call on her name and I might turn around and say, well, Stephanie, I've got a question for you. Can you tell me? And then we go on. You know, we call it door knocking. We're kind of bringing someone's attention back into the session. Our next actual rule is the stress rule. You know, and it's quite funny because many people don't think of learning as being something that can be stressful. And the reality is that stressed brains don't actually work or don't learn in the same way. If you think about it, as a learner, if you're stressed out about a particular part of the learning, it's not going to sit well in your brain. It's not going to work well. Why? Well, we've got this built-in mechanism. It goes back to the saber-toothed tiger days. We've got this built-in mechanism where we've got this fight or flight instinct. You know, and where does that actually come into itself in the virtual classroom or in the classroom, do you think? It comes in where you're asking me, you're the facilitator, you're asking me as the learner to do something I'm not comfortable with. It could be you're asking me to do a role play or to actually, you know, do something in terms of a scenario or a case study, something that's not comfortable for me. And that's fine, but as long as the environment doesn't cause me to actually feel too stressed, I might step up and do it. You know, asking learners to step up and do a role play before they're ready or before they're able to do it can be extremely stressful. And that's not conducive to the learner achieving a great outcome from the learning itself. You might be familiar with the conscious competence model of learning. You know, and to some extent, I'm going to say that we do want a little bit of stress in the life of a learner, but we don't want too much. You see, learning itself is stressful, because if we think to the conscious competence model of learning, when you begin to actually learn a new skill or something brand new for the very first time, you're in what we call the state of unconscious incompetence. It's often referred to as you don't know what you don't know. You know, and if you think about it, if you remember back to when you started to drive a motor vehicle, you know, an automobile, a car for the very first time, you know, and you sat behind the wheel, as a child or as a teenager, you'd been watching your parents driving this vehicle, taking you back and forward to band practice and to the sports at the weekend and to school and everything else. And you probably sat in the back seat thinking, yeah, it looks easy, until the first day you sat behind the wheel. And your father handed you the keys, you started the car, you put it in gear, and, you know, nothing happened. You then get to a stage of conscious incompetence. Very quickly, you get to that point where you think, this isn't as easy as I thought it was going to be. You know, and that's a very frustrating state of learning to be in. It's very emotive. You know, you can be very emotional when you're actually in the state of conscious incompetence. But over time, and as we practice, we get to this level of conscious competence. And that's great. We now know what we need to know. We're now developing that skill set. We're changing that behavior. And things are starting to work for us. And it's great. But it's quite mechanical for us. It's quite deliberate in terms of our approach. We're not quite doing it with, you know, in an automatic way. We're not doing it with any sort of major instinct. It's still quite labored. And then we get into that final point of unconscious competence. This is where we kind of get into autopilot. You know, if you think about it, most of us, you know, right now, probably in terms of how we drive a car, have gotten into the state of unconscious competence. You know, we jump in the car, we put the keys in the ignition, we stick the car and drive, and we drive off. We don't think about it in the same way. We don't have to. But the reality for us is when we actually sit with our learners in states of conscious incompetence and conscious competence, our learners can get freaked out. That's where the stress rule comes in. That's where we've got to be thoughtful about, are we likely to embarrass that learner in front of their peers? If we are, that's not great for them. It could be that, and particularly with in Asia, what we've actually got is that you've got something called quanji, which is loss of face. You know, if I, as a learner, am going to actually be asked to respond to something, and I'm going to get that answer wrong, I'm going to lose face in front of my colleagues. I'm going to lose potential, you know, respect from them in front of my peer group. And as a result, I want to be able to be comfortable. There's also stress from the point of view of overloading the learner's brain. I think that far too often in a learning event, what we actually end up doing is we overload the brain. We put too much knowledge, too much information. You know, we're likely to be stressing our learners out. And what I'd like you to do is just think about this. How else do you think we stress learners out in a learning event? I'm going to pause and just take that for a minute. I'm seeing a question which has come in. Why wait as long as 10 minutes? Research shows that people lose interest in a matter of seconds. Well, if we think about the learning that we need to provide, you know, most of it, I'm going to suggest, is we provide knowledge. And so that we need to explain a model or a framework or you know, a process. So that's going to take time. You know, it might take us 2-3 minutes, might take us 4 minutes, might take us 6 minutes. But it's not a case of we can't take seconds to do that. So what we've got to do is try and balance it out. You know, 10 minutes is the average length of time that someone's going to sit on the same topic. There's a gentleman in the US called Bob Pike. He's a fantastic trainer. And he talks about the 90-28 rule. The 90 minutes is the average length of time that someone will actually sit in a learning event before they need a break. 20 minutes is the average length of time for someone to be able to sit on the same topic before you actually need to do something with it. It really refers to the short-term working memory and taking the learning and actually putting it into application, or helping the learner to process that knowledge. So there is an element which says, yes, we're talking about our attention gap is 10 seconds or less, but we can't provide too much learning in 10 seconds. But we've got to chunk it down. Part of this overloading of people's brains, I'm sure we're all seeing the challenge of, we used to do something as a 2-day or a 3-day face-to-face event. We loaded everything into that workshop. The learner left at the end of the 2 days, 3 days, and we kind of went, bye, go off and actually apply that. And as a result, learners had too much knowledge, too much information, and reality is the 21st century, we've now got learners that actually want to learn in shorter and sharper interventions. Virtual classroom 2-hour programs, not 3-day face-to-face events. So how else do you think that we can actually see stress, too much content in a short period of time, using jargon? Absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, there's the whole sense of, we use expressions in our everyday language, like idioms. America, you've got a real penchant, if you like, for using sporting analogies. He hit it out of the park. It was a home run. Hang on. What if that learner doesn't know baseball? Those analogies, those expressions, just have gone out the window. The comment in chat there, was that 90 and 20 minutes from Bob Pike? Yep, it's a 3-part equation, 90, 20, and 8. 8 is the variety element. So when you're in a training session, change up the activity every 8 minutes on average. We still follow that same kind of formula, 90, 20, and for virtual classroom, but we bring it to 90, 24. In other words, where in the face-to-face classroom you want to do a change up every 8 minutes, about 4 minutes in the virtual classroom. Keep it moving. Not keep it moving for the sake of moving, but keep people moving along. Why? Because it's part of the sensory integration. Part of sensory integration, which is the next rule that we're going to talk about, is stimulating more of the senses. If you think about it in terms of when we actually work in the face-to-face classroom, it's not about you just listening to me. It's not about me asking questions of you. We actually show visuals, or video footage. We get you to e-learning. Again, from a learning perspective, we need to be very much appealing to more of the senses of the learner. Now, unfortunately, we've not been able to master the sense of smell when it actually comes to the virtual classroom. My coffee cup isn't sort of wafting over to you and you're smelling the coffee and that, but how can we actually appeal to the senses? Well, the reality for us is we can do that very well by the way in which we actually use visuals. And a lot of the comments that you actually gave me earlier were, if you think about it, the way in which I'm using the visuals in our session. There's a lot of animation that's in there. The slides are building as we go along. They're kind of following along with the actual narrative that I'm providing for the actual session. And we need to make sure we appeal to learner senses. We switch people off. We give them the opportunity to multitask when we don't appeal to those senses. I'm going to just wait and see what sort of responses you're going to give me here. In terms of, everything that we've done has evolved. Our brains evolved from day one. Our senses did. And they actually work in tandem. So Kathy's talking about animated visuals, audio deflections and inflections, talking about stories, eye contact, video, music. We've got all of this variety, and the reality is that's why blended learning works so well. The more we blend the learning, the more we actually give people different stimuli, the more likelihood that people are going to learn and learn effectively. We've got to make sure, and I'm talking about learning here, not in a webinar, but we've got to make sure that we actually make it more than just a single voice. I've got to confess, I've been involved in the virtual classroom space now for about 8 years. And in that time, I've seen some real challenges where facilitators that are in a training event are being that single voice. They're keeping just one voice going all the time. They're not giving people the opportunity to interact and to speak. And I've got to confess, if that is you as a facilitator, just record yourself on video and send the audience the video instead. You'll save everyone a lot of heartache. They'll probably won't watch the video. But in fairness, if you're the only voice in the session, do you honestly think they're listening to your every word? We've really got to change it up for our people. We're coming pretty much towards the end. We've got 2 more rules to look at, and this one I love because it sits alongside the sensory integration. This is the rule of vision. And our vision trumps all other senses. It really does. And when we actually think about our vision, I'd like you to think about how often are you thinking about the imagery that you actually use in your slides? Are you putting images on the slide and it's embellishment? Or do the images actually resonate for the audience? Do they actually get the audience thinking about, okay, this image here is talking about eye is vision. Okay, that works. Antonio, you're absolutely right, and I'm going to just about prove that in just about 30 seconds here, because we are visual creatures. Again, this is one of the reasons why the rules actually stack up and tell you it's better for learning. Because vision trumps all other senses. What I'm going to do in a second, I'm going to show you some stills that have been grabbed from a video which was actually played. It's an advert. What I'd like you to do, as you're looking at these images appear on screen, in the chat panel, let me know what the product is. So I want you to sort of think about what's the advert. You might know it. You might know the product. You might know the company. Any one of those answers is going to be absolutely correct. You ready? There you go. Look at it. It's beer. It's Budweiser. It's a pet product. No, it's not a pet product. It actually was played during the 2010 Super Bowl. It was the Budweiser advert about this Labrador puppy that befriended this group of Clydesdale horses. And it was done under the hashtag of best buds. But look, there's the perfect example. Vision trumps every other sense. Our memories came flooded back the minute you saw 2 or 3 or 4 of those images. Why? Because vision trumps every other sense that we've got. You see, when we actually think about providing learning to people, we've got a number of different stimuli that we can actually provide. We can turn around and we can give the learning orally. We can actually just provide the narrative, the rhetoric, the talk. If we do, and if we only provide that knowledge by oral stimulation, so physically by somebody speaking to you, the likelihood is they're actually going to retain just 10% of learning. If I'm going to provide it just visually, there's no audio over the top of that, it's just visual, the chances are you'll retain 35%. So we've got a bit of a premium, we've got an increase there. However, if we combine, so audio and visual at the same time, so the slides actually back up and support the narrative, the chances are you're actually going to learn and retain 65% of that information. 6 times more impact. And that's really where and why we need that. We need those visual elements. And those visual elements do not need to just be on the slides. Within the company I work with, we create participant materials. In a face-to-face training program, it's the learning binder that you hand out to people. We create them, they're extremely visual. Why? It's really because vision actually trumps everything else. And 2 of the actual heroes that I would say about vision, if you haven't already come across these people, Nancy Duarte and Gar Reynolds. They are my superheroes, if you like, in terms of good visual design. If you haven't come across them, by all means, please go off. There's 3 things I'm going to share with you today. John Medina's Brain Rules, Slideology, Nancy Duarte, Presentation Zen, Gar Reynolds. They will completely transform you in terms of how you think about learning, but also how you present that learning and that knowledge. The final rule that we're going to go into is exploration. The exploration rule is that we are powerful and we're very natural explorers. If you think about it, part of the evolution of our brain, part of that natural curiosity, that exploration, has helped us to actually put people on the moon, dive the deepest of oceans, cross the continents as we've done. It's amazing. We have this natural curiosity that we actually have as a child. I've got a 6-year-old boy, and every question is why, why, why. It's that natural curiosity. The unfortunate thing is we then send them to school and we knock that natural curiosity out of them. We eventually, the natural curiosity isn't there anymore. And what actually happens is they will learn very much by mirroring others. If we're not curious back with them as children, then they start losing that curiosity spirit. And really, what I'd ask you to think about is, what do you do in a learning event that provokes a learner's natural curiosity? Again, something that Medina came up with, if you wanted to create an education environment that was directly opposed to what the brain was doing, or good at doing, you'd probably design a classroom. Geez, that's really frightening for us. The room that we've created isn't great at helping the brain do what its brain's good at doing. So yes, as you're putting in there, it's gamification, it's case studies, it's asking them to give personal examples, it's using provocative questioning, it's giving them an opportunity to be hands-on. We've got to appeal to this rule of exploration. Why? If we're exploring, if we're getting a much more experiential learning experience, we're likely to have more joy and more fun in doing it. If we actually provide all the learning, if we provide all the answers, if we provide all of the narrative, it's not great learning for the learner at all. There's a fantastic quote that I live and breathe by. That is from Goethe. Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Being willing is not enough, we must do. I've tended to think and figure of it that it actually sits extremely well in learning. If you think about it from the point of view of knowing is not enough, we must apply. If we provide the knowledge to the learner and they don't go off and apply it, it's been a waste of time. Being willing is not enough, we must do. We can get a learner doing all the action planning, all the willingness to go off and do something. If they don't go off and do it, it's a waste of time. I would encourage and ask you to think about, from today's webinar, what is it that you're going to do with the knowledge? How are you going to apply it? And if you've got the willingness to change, when are you going to do it? With that, I'm going to pause and thank you very much for being part of today's event. I do want to actually just point out that there are some takeaways for you. So in the bottom right-hand corner, today's takeaways, you can download the copy of today's slides in PDF format. You can actually also download, we put together an infographic on the actual event. And then on the left-hand side, there's a number of different links for various events. At the very top, you'll see that I'm back with MeetingOne on the 6th of April. This time I'm looking at 5 ways to make virtual training as effective as face-to-face. But for now, we're pretty much on our time. And hopefully I've answered questions as we've gone along. Any questions that we need to pick up on? Brittany, let me just find out if there's anything that we need to pick up on. If you do still have a question, put it into that Q&A panel. Let's get it. Alicia, very excited to read the book. I've got to confess, it's had a huge effect on me, but having read it some 6-7 years ago. I was actually involved with it's now ATD, Association for Talent Development, but I actually helped to actually run the first expert panel for the Science of Learning, which is ATD's version, looking at the actual neuroscience of learning. So let's see. Yes, you will get access to this as a recording. It will be recorded. That will be sent out to you within about 24 hours after today's event. If you want a copy of the slides, free for you to actually grab those and use them. They're in the takeaway section at the bottom there. Thank you very much for those comments. Kathy, thank you very much. Best video conference I've been at in a very long time. I aim to impress. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to share this info with my director. Stop her using bad clip art. Please, 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 absolutely. For me, clip art should be banned. It's one of those things that we should actually put in a room and lock it away forever. A good visual beats everything else. Terry, question for online training: do you recommend audio to all slides, or can we do a combination? I think we can do a combination. And when you actually say online training, I'm going to guess that you're probably talking about e-learning there. Sometimes a slide or an e-learning slide doesn't need to have audio. So I think you can mix it up. Vicky, thank you. Thanks for your comment. Alejandro, thank you very much. Anastasia, thank you so much. What are some good research studies to look at for a doctoral student? Anastasia, what I'm going to do is let me just pop my email address into chat there for you. Let me ask you to fire it as an email to me. I don't have something that's immediately top of mind, but if you do want to, you've got my email address there. Just send me an email and I'll send something back for you. Estelle, others that are actually doing it, thank you very much. Delighted that you actually are talking, giving me those comments. There were a couple of things in terms of the books. Let me go back a slide so you can actually grab it there. What are the books you recommended? Slideology, Nancy Duarte. Presentation, Zangar Reynolds. And of course, John Medina's Brain Rules. Excellent. So with that, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. So I'm going to suggest that if there are no other questions, I'm going to wish you a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. Have a look out for that next webinar. If you're moving training online, what we're actually going to be talking about is how we can ensure that our virtual classroom training is every bit as effective as good face-to-face training. So with that, thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the day. I'm going to stay on the line. I'll pick up on any questions that I see coming in. If not, thanks very much. Take care.